The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the dusty Nevada road, and Julia Parker clutched the wooden seat so hard her knuckles turned white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild bird desperate to escape its cage. Everything frightened her, from the creaking wheels beneath her feet to the possibility that the horses might bolt at any moment, sending her tumbling into the sagebrush that stretched endlessly across the barren landscape. She had traveled all the way from Pennsylvania to become a mail-order bride to a rancher named Thomas Wendell, a man she had never met, and the terror of that unknown future pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. The year was 1882, and women like her, alone in the world with no family and few prospects, often had little choice but to answer advertisements placed by lonely men in frontier newspapers, hoping for security even if love seemed an impossible dream. The other passengers, a grizzled miner and a stern-faced woman in black, paid Julia no attention as she sat trembling in her corner, her small carpetbag clutched in her lap. She had tried to appear brave when she left Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, but the journey had stripped away any pretense of courage. Every strange sound, every rough town, every leering face at the way stations had confirmed what she already knew about herself. She was a coward, plain and simple, and now she was traveling to marry a stranger in a wild territory where anything could happen. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Eureka, Nevada, Julia thought she might be sick. The mining town sprawled across a valley surrounded by dusty mountains, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and the sound of hammering echoed from somewhere beyond the livery stable. Men in dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hats stood outside the saloons, watching the stagecoach with idle curiosity. Julia's breath came in short gasps as the driver pulled the horses to a stop in front of the Wells Fargo office. "Eureka," the driver announced, his voice rough from years of shouting over the thunder of hooves and wheels. "Watch your step, miss." Julia forced her trembling legs to carry her down from the coach, nearly stumbling on the last step. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and dust coated everything in sight. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, clutching her carpetbag, looking around desperately for Thomas Wendell. He was supposed to meet her here. What if he had changed his mind? What if she was stranded in this frightening place with nowhere to go? "Miss Parker." The voice made her jump, and she spun around to see a portly man in his 50s approaching, his face red from the heat. He wore a suit that had seen better days, and his eyes looked kind but weary. "Yes, I am Julia Parker," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression shifted, becoming uncomfortable. He removed his hat and twisted it in his hands. "Miss Parker, I am afraid I have difficult news. I am Dr. Harrison, and I have been looking after Thomas Wendell. He took ill about a week ago. Pneumonia. We did everything we could, but he passed away 3 days ago." The world seemed to tilt beneath Julia's feet. Dead. Her intended husband was dead, and she was standing in a strange town with $23 to her name and nowhere to go. The panic that always lurked just beneath her surface threatened to overwhelm her completely. Her vision blurred, and she swayed on her feet. "Steady now," Dr. Harrison said, reaching out to support her elbow. "Come sit down. You have had a shock." He guided her to a bench outside the Wells Fargo office, and she collapsed onto it, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. She could not go back to Pennsylvania. There was nothing for her there except memories of the aunt who had raised her after her parents died. And that aunt had passed away 6 months ago, leaving Julia alone in a boarding house where the rent kept climbing, and the landlady kept making suggestions about how a pretty young woman might earn extra money. That was why Julia had answered Thomas Wendell's advertisement in the first place. "What will I do?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to contain them. "I have no money for the fare back east, and I have nowhere to go." Dr. Harrison patted her shoulder awkwardly. "There now. We will figure something out. Eureka is a rough town, but we are not without Christian charity. Perhaps you could find work as a seamstress or a cook. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house might have a room available." Julia nodded mechanically, but inside she was screaming. How could she possibly survive in this place? She was afraid of everything. Afraid of strangers, afraid of violence, afraid of horses, afraid of the vast empty spaces that surrounded the town. She had barely survived the journey here, and now she was supposed to make a life in this hostile environment. "Let me take you to the boarding house," Dr. Harrison said. "You need to rest and have something to eat. Things will look better after you have had some time to collect yourself." Julia allowed herself to be led down the street, past the saloons and stores and the assay office. Men stared at her as she passed, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, terrified of drawing attention. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure at the end of the main street, painted white but already graying with dust. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with iron-gray hair, listened to Dr. Harrison explain the situation, and then gave Julia a long, measuring look. "I suppose you can stay for a few days while you sort yourself out," she said finally. "But I will need payment by the end of the week. I run a respectable establishment and I cannot afford charity cases." "Thank you," Julia whispered, clutching her carpetbag tighter. The room was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. Julia sat on the edge of the bed after Dr. Harrison left, staring at the bare walls and trying not to give in to complete despair. She had to find work, but what could she do? She was a barely adequate seamstress, a mediocre cook, and her fear of everything made her clumsy and awkward. Who would hire someone like her? For 2 days, Julia barely left her room except to choke down meals in the boarding house dining room and make tentative inquiries about work. The general store did not need help. The restaurant already had a cook. The laundry was run by Chinese workers who lived in their own section of town. Every rejection made her more terrified, more certain that she would end up on the street or worse. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Henderson cornered her in the hallway. "You will need to pay for your room by tomorrow, Miss Parker, or I will have to ask you to leave." "I understand," Julia said, her voice shaking. "I am trying to find employment." "Try harder," Mrs. Henderson said sharply. "Or perhaps you should consider other options. A pretty girl like you could make good money if she was not so particular." Julia fled to her room, her face burning with shame and fear. She knew what Mrs. Henderson was suggesting, and the thought made her stomach churn. She would rather starve, but starvation seemed like a very real possibility at this point. That evening, desperate beyond measure, Julia forced herself to walk to the mercantile to see if they might need someone to clean or organize stock. The sun was setting, painting the dusty street in shades of orange and red, and most of the businesses were closing for the day. As she walked, keeping close to the buildings and trying to make herself invisible, she heard shouting from one of the saloons. 2 men stumbled out into the street, clearly drunk and angry. One of them pulled a knife and Julia froze, terror rooting her to the spot. She knew she should run, should get out of the way, but her body would not obey. She could only stand there, shaking, as the men circled each other. "Better move, miss." The voice was low and calm, and Julia turned to see a man standing beside her. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore dusty work clothes and carried himself with an easy confidence that seemed completely foreign to Julia. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with strong features and a day's worth of stubble on his jaw. "I cannot," Julia gasped. "I cannot move." Without hesitation, the man put his arm around her shoulders and guided her quickly across the street, away from the fighting men. His touch was firm but gentle, and Julia found herself being steered into the doorway of the Mercantile just as the two drunks crashed into the spot where she had been standing moments before. "You are safe now," the man said, releasing her and stepping back to give her space. "Those fools will wear themselves out soon enough. The sheriff will break it up before anyone gets seriously hurt." Julia's legs gave out, and she sagged against the doorframe, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The man watched her with concern, his expression kind but not pitying. "You all right, miss? You look like you have seen a ghost." "I am sorry," Julia managed to say. "I am not very brave." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Takes a different kind of courage to admit that." "I am Jeremiah Reeves. Most folks call me Jem, Julia Parker," she whispered. "I just arrived a few days ago." "You picked a lively time to visit Eureka," Jem said. "Though I expect you did not come here for the entertainment. Let me guess. Mail order bride." Julia nodded, humiliation washing over her. "My intended husband passed away before I arrived. Now I am stranded here with no prospects and nowhere to go." Jem's expression grew serious. "That is a hard situation. What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything," Julia said desperately. "I can sew a little and I can cook simple meals. I am willing to clean or help in any way. I just need to earn enough money to pay for my room and food." Jem was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "I might have something," he said finally. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside of town. I run cattle and horses, and I have been needing someone to help with the house and the cooking. My last housekeeper got married and moved to California with her husband. The work is hard and the place is isolated, but the pay is fair and you would have your own cabin. If you are interested, I can take you out there tomorrow so you can see the place." Julia stared at him, torn between desperate hope and familiar fear. Going to work on an isolated ranch for a man she had just met seemed terrifyingly dangerous. What if he was not what he seemed? What if he had bad intentions? But what choice did she have? In another day, she would be on the street with nowhere to go. "I know you do not know me from Adam," Jem said, as if reading her thoughts. "But I can give you references in town. Talk to Sheriff Morrison or the banker, Albert Chen. They have known me since I settled here 4 years ago. I am offering honest work for honest pay, nothing more." "Why would you help me?" Julia asked. "You do not know me," Jem shrugged. "You look like you could use some help and I genuinely need a housekeeper. Seems like it might work out for both of us. But think it over tonight, and if you decide you are interested, meet me at the livery stable tomorrow morning at 8. If you do not show up, I will understand." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, leaving Julia standing in the doorway as the sheriff arrived to break up the fight. She watched Jem's retreating figure, noticing the confident way he moved, the respectful distance he maintained from her, the kindness in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer to her desperate prayers. That night, Julia lay awake in her narrow bed, wrestling with fear and hope. Every instinct screamed at her that going to work for a strange man on an isolated ranch was dangerous. But staying in town with no money and no prospects was equally dangerous, perhaps more so. At least Jem Reeves had offered her honest work. At least he had given her references to check. In the morning, Julia forced herself to visit the sheriff's office. Sheriff Morrison was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. When she asked about Jeremiah Reeves, His weathered face broke into a smile. "Jem, good man. Honest as the day is long. He settled here after working as a ranch hand over in California. Saved his money and bought that spread 5 miles out. Works harder than any man I know. You could do worse than work for Jeremiah Reeves." Julia also spoke with Albert Chen at the bank, who confirmed the sheriff's assessment. "Jem is one of our most reliable customers. He always pays his debts on time, and I have never heard a word spoken against his character. If he has offered you employment, you can trust him." With trembling hands and a heart full of conflicting emotions, Julia gathered her few belongings and walked to the livery stable at 8 o'clock. Jem was already there, checking the harness on a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with a genuine smile that made him even more handsome. "I am glad you decided to come," he said. "Let me help you with that bag." Julia had expected to ride in the wagon, but the sight of the horses made her freeze. They were large animals, powerful and unpredictable, and she was terrified of them. "What is wrong?" Jem asked, noticing her hesitation. "The horses," Julia admitted, her face burning. "I am afraid of them." Jem did not laugh or mock her. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Well, out here, you are going to be around horses a lot, but we can take it slow. Come here, I want you to meet these 2. Julia wanted to refuse, wanted to stay far away from the large animals, but Jem's calm confidence was somehow reassuring. She forced herself to take a few steps closer, her hands clenched at her sides. "This is Daisy," Jem said, patting the closer horse, a dappled gray mare with gentle eyes. "And this is Buck. They are both as calm as can be. Daisy here has been pulling wagons for 10 years and nothing spooks her. Here, just touch her nose. See how soft it is." Julia reached out with a shaking hand and barely brushed her fingers against the horse's velvety nose. Daisy snorted softly, and Julia jumped back with a small cry. "She is just saying hello," Jem said patiently. "Try again. Just rest your hand there for a moment." It took several attempts, but finally Julia managed to keep her hand on Daisy's nose for a few seconds. The horse stood perfectly still, her large dark eyes calm and patient. "See," Jem said. "Nothing to fear. Now let us get you up in the wagon. I promise Daisy and Buck will take good care of us." The ride out to the ranch was an exercise in controlled terror for Julia. Every bounce of the wagon, every movement of the horses made her tense and grip the seat. But Jem talked the whole way, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the ranch, and somehow his steady presence made the fear a little more bearable. "I have about 200 head of cattle right now," he explained as they rolled across the open prairie. "And I am starting to breed horses too. Good horses fetch a fine price, and I have always had a way with them. The ranch house is not fancy, but it is solid. I built most of it myself with help from a few hands. The cabin where you would stay is about 50 yards from the main house, so you will have your privacy." Julia managed to nod, though her throat was too tight to speak. The landscape was so vast and empty, with nothing but sagebrush and distant mountains in every direction. How did people live in such isolation? What if something happened? What if there was trouble? The ranch, when it came into view, was more substantial than Julia had expected. The main house was a long, low building made of logs and rough-hewn planks, with a wide porch across the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a barn, a corral, and a small cabin that Jem pointed out as her quarters. Despite her fear, Julia could see that the ranch was well maintained and clearly the product of hard work. "Let me show you around," Jem said, helping her down from the wagon. Julia tried not to notice how strong his hands were, how easily he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The main house interior was rough but clean, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and simple furniture arranged around a central living space. The kitchen was spacious, with a good stove and ample workspace. Dishes were piled in the basin, and dust covered most surfaces. "I have been batching it for 3 months now," Jem admitted with a sheepish grin. "As you can see, I am not much of a housekeeper. Your duties would be cooking meals, keeping the house clean, doing laundry, and maybe tending a garden if you are inclined. I would pay you $20 a month plus room and board. You would have Sundays off, and I would bring you into town whenever you wanted to go." $20 a month was more than Julia had dared hope for. It was enough to save money, to perhaps eventually buy a ticket back east if she decided to leave. But more importantly, it was honest work, and Jem Reeves seemed like an honest man. "I would like to try," Julia said softly, "if you are willing to take a chance on me." "Then we have a deal," Jem said, extending his hand. Julia shook it quickly, startled by the warmth and strength of his grip. The small cabin that would be her home was simple but charming, with a real bed, a small stove, and a rocking chair by the window. Someone, probably Jem, had made an effort to make it welcoming, with clean linens on the bed and wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. "You settle in," Jem said from the doorway. "When you are ready, come up to the main house and I will show you where everything is in the kitchen. No rush. Take your time." After he left, Julia sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. She was still terrified, still overwhelmed by the vastness of this place and the isolation and the 100 things that could go wrong. But for the first time since she had left Pennsylvania, she felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. The first few days at the ranch were a constant battle between Julia's determination to do well and her paralyzing fears. The kitchen was manageable, though she jumped every time the stove popped or the wind rattled the windows. Cooking for Jem was not difficult because he ate simple food and was genuinely grateful for every meal. But venturing outside the house was another matter entirely. On her third morning, Jem found her standing at the back door, frozen with fear. "What is it?" he asked gently. "I need to hang the laundry," Julia said, her voice trembling. "But the space out there is so open. What if something happens? What if there are wild animals or snakes?" Jem came to stand beside her, looking out at the clothesline that stood about 20 yards from the house. "I understand that fear," he said. "This country is big and it can feel threatening, but let me teach you something. Fear is not your enemy, Julia. Fear is information. It tells you to be cautious, to pay attention, but you cannot let it stop you from living." "Easy for you to say," Julia whispered. "You are not afraid of anything." "That is not true," Jem said. "I am afraid of plenty of things: drought, cattle sickness, market crashes that could cost me everything I have worked for. But I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid." He picked up the laundry basket. "Come on. I will walk with you. We will hang this washing together, and I will show you that it is safe." Julia forced her feet to move, following Jem out into the bright sunlight. Her heart pounded as they walked across the open ground to the clothesline, but nothing terrible happened. No wild animals appeared. The sky did not fall. They hung the laundry together, and Jem talked about ordinary things like the weather and the cattle, and somehow his calm presence made the fear a little smaller. Over the following weeks, Jem patiently helped Julia face her fears one at a time. He taught her to recognize the difference between real danger and imagined threats. When she was afraid to go to the well alone, he walked with her every day until the path became familiar. When she panicked at the sight of a snake near the garden, he showed her how to identify which snakes were dangerous and which were harmless, and how to give them a wide berth without losing her composure. "The thing is," Jem explained one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. Most creatures out here do not want anything to do with humans. They will leave you alone if you leave them alone. You just have to learn to read the signs. Julia watched him in the fading light, noticing the way his hands moved as he talked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. He was the most patient man she had ever met, never once making her feel foolish for her fears. And slowly, almost without her realizing it, those fears were beginning to lose their grip on her one afternoon. About 6 weeks after Julia had arrived at the ranch, a violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. The sky turned black, and lightning split the air with terrifying cracks. Julia was in the main house preparing supper when the storm hit, and she immediately dropped to the floor, curling into a ball and covering her head with her arms. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Jem found her there a few minutes later, having run in from the barn. "Julia," he said, kneeling beside her. "Julia, you are safe, the house is solid, nothing is going to happen to you." "I cannot help it," she gasped. "The storm, it is too loud, too frightening." Without asking permission, Jem sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "I need you to breathe with me, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Come on, match my breathing." He breathed slowly and deliberately, and Julia tried to follow his rhythm. Gradually, her panic began to subside, though she was still shaking. "That is it," Jem said encouragingly. "Keep breathing. Now I want you to tell me 5 things you can see." "What?" Julia managed to gasp. "5 things you can see right now. Name them for me." Julia forced herself to look around. "The table, the stove, your boots, the window, the chair." "Good. Now 4 things you can touch." Julia reached out and touched the floor, the floorboards, your shirt, my dress, the table leg. 3 things you can hear. This was harder because the storm was so loud, but Julia focused. "The rain, your voice, my own breathing." 2 things you can smell. "The bread I was baking, wood smoke." 1 thing you can taste, the biscuit I had with lunch. By the time she finished the exercise, Julia's panic had subsided to manageable fear. She was still frightened, but she was no longer paralyzed by terror. "How did you know to do that?" she asked, looking up at Jem with wonder. "Had a fellow soldier during my time in the army who got bad episodes after battles," Jem explained. "A doctor taught him that trick. It helps pull your mind back from the edge of panic. You can use it anytime you feel fear taking over." "You were in the army?" Julia asked. "For 4 years. I joined up when I was 19, served until I was 23, saw some action against rustlers and bandits, did a lot of patrolling. It taught me about discipline and hard work, but I knew I did not want to be a soldier forever. When I mustered out, I came west to make my own way." The storm raged outside, but inside the house, Julia felt strangely safe sitting on the floor with Jem's arm still around her shoulders. She knew she should move away, that this was not proper, but she could not make herself break the contact. "You have been very patient with me," she said softly. "I do not understand why." Jem was quiet for a moment. "My mother was like you," he said finally, "afraid of everything. My father was a hard man, and he had no patience for her fears. He would mock her and tell her she was weak. I watched it break her spirit little by little. When I see someone struggling with fear, I think of her, and I think about how different things might have been if someone had just been kind to her." "I am sorry," Julia whispered. "That must have been hard to watch." "It was. But it taught me something important. Courage can be learned. Bravery is not something you are born with. It is something you practice like any other skill." Over the next few months, Julia practiced courage every day. Jem never pushed her too hard, but he also never let her hide from the things that frightened her. When she was afraid to approach the horses in the corral, he spent hours teaching her how to move around them safely, how to read their body language, how to earn their trust. When she was terrified of riding, he put her on the gentlest mare in his string and led her around the corral at a walk until she could breathe again. The thing about horses, Jem explained, is that they are prey animals. They are naturally nervous and alert. But they are also smart, and they can learn to trust you. When you are calm and confident around them, they feel safer. Your fear makes them nervous because they think there must be something to fear. Julia forced herself to relax her shoulders, to breathe deeply, to project the calm she did not yet feel. And amazingly, the mare beneath her seemed to sense the change. Her ears, which had been pinned back nervously, pricked forward. Her gait became smoother. "There you go," Jem said with obvious pride. "You are doing it. You are riding." A smile broke across Julia's face, the first genuinely joyful expression she could remember in years. "I am riding," she breathed. "Jem, I am actually riding." "You are," he confirmed, and the look in his eyes made Julia's heart skip in an entirely different way than fear. As autumn painted the Nevada mountains with gold and crimson, Julia realized that she was falling in love with Jeremiah Reeves. It had happened so gradually that she could not pinpoint the exact moment, but now the feeling was undeniable. She loved the way he laughed at his own jokes. She loved how he sang off-key while he worked. She loved his patience and his kindness, and the way he treated her like she was brave even when they both knew she was still afraid of so many things. But Julia had no idea if Jem felt the same way. He was unfailingly respectful, keeping a careful distance between them except when he was helping her overcome a specific fear. He never said anything improper or made advances. Sometimes Julia caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, but he always turned away before she could interpret it. One October evening, Jem announced that he needed to drive a dozen head of cattle to a ranch about 20 miles away and would be gone overnight. Julia's first reaction was panic at the thought of being alone at the ranch, but she forced herself to breathe and think rationally. She had been here for 4 months now. She knew the ranch. She knew what to do if there was a problem. She could manage one night alone. "I will be fine," she told Jem, proud that her voice only shook a little. Jem studied her face. "Are you sure? I can see if one of the hands from the neighboring ranch can come stay in the barn just so you would not be completely alone." "No," Julia said firmly. "I can do this. You have taught me that I am stronger than I think. I need to prove it to myself." "All right," Jem said, and the pride in his eyes made Julia's heart sing. "But I am leaving you the rifle and you know how to use it. Not that you will need to, but just in case. I will be back by noon tomorrow." After Jem left in the morning, driving the cattle ahead of him, Julia kept herself busy with chores. She cleaned the already clean house, baked bread, worked in the garden, and did all the things that had become routine. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the prairie, she felt fear creeping in, but she used the breathing techniques Jem had taught her and focused on the facts rather than her imagination. She was in a solid house with locked doors. She had food and water. She had the rifle if she needed it. Nothing was going to happen to her. The night was dark and full of unfamiliar sounds, but Julia made herself sit at the kitchen table and work on mending by lamplight instead of cowering in her cabin. Every time fear threatened to overwhelm her, she talked herself through it the way Jem would have done. When dawn broke and she realized she had made it through the night alone, Julia felt a surge of triumph unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had done it. She had spent a night alone at the ranch without giving in to panic. She had faced her fear and survived. Jem returned around noon as promised, and the moment he walked through the door, Julia flew at him, throwing her arms around his neck without thinking. "I did it," she cried. "I stayed alone all night and I was all right." Jem caught her in his arms, steadying them both. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Then, before Julia could think about what was happening, he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Julia did not want to pull away. She wanted to stay in his arms forever, wanted to feel his lips on hers, wanted to finally acknowledge the love that had been growing between them for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jem looked at her with such tenderness that Julia thought her heart might burst. "I am sorry," he said. "I should not have done that without asking. But Julia, I have been in love with you for months now, and seeing you so proud and brave just made me forget myself." "You love me," Julia whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "I love you," Jem confirmed. "I think I started falling for you that first night in town when you admitted you were not brave. You were the most honest person I had ever met. And watching you fight your fears every single day, watching you grow stronger and braver, has only made me love you more." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she said. "I have been so afraid to say anything, afraid that you only saw me as your housekeeper, afraid that I was not good enough for you." Jem cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You are brave and beautiful and kind, and I would be honored if you would consider being my wife. Not because you need security or because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to build a life with me." "Yes," Julia said without hesitation. "Yes, I want to marry you. I want to stay here and build a life with you and keep learning to be brave." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Eureka. Julia wore a new dress she had sewn herself from blue calico that matched Jem's eyes, and Jem wore his best suit and could not stop smiling. Sheriff Morrison stood up as Jem's best man, and Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house attended as Julia's witness, looking pleased to see the frightened girl who had arrived months ago now radiant with happiness. The ranch became truly home after that. As Jem's wife, Julia threw herself into making their house comfortable and welcoming. She planted a larger garden, learned to make curtains and quilts, and practiced cooking more ambitious meals. And Jem continued to help her face her fears with endless patience. When winter came and the first heavy snowfall blanketed the ranch, Julia was terrified of being trapped and isolated. But Jem taught her how to appreciate the beauty of the season, how to prepare properly so they had everything they needed, how to stay warm and safe even when the wind howled around the house. "We have each other," he told her as they sat by the fire one snowy evening. "As long as we have that, we can face anything." In the spring, Jem taught Julia to ride properly, not just walk around the corral but actually ride across the open prairie. The first time they galloped together across the sagebrush flats with the wind in their faces and the mountains rising purple in the distance, Julia laughed with pure joy. The girl who had been afraid of everything was racing across the Nevada landscape on horseback, and the freedom was intoxicating. That summer brought new challenges. A drought threatened the ranch's water supply, and Julia had to overcome her fear of the unknown to help Jem dig a new well. They worked side by side in the blazing heat, and when they finally struck water, they celebrated by dancing in the spray, muddy and exhausted and completely happy. In the fall, a band of cattle rustlers began operating in the area. Several neighboring ranches lost stock, and everyone was on edge. Julia's old fears threatened to resurface, but Jem taught her how to shoot the rifle accurately and what to do if trouble came to their door. "The key is not to eliminate fear," he explained. "Fear keeps us alert and careful. The key is to make sure fear does not paralyze you. You feel the fear, you acknowledge it, and then you do what needs to be done anyway." One night, Julia woke to hear someone trying to break into the barn. Jem was already awake, pulling on his boots and reaching for his rifle. Every instinct in Julia's body screamed at her to hide, but instead she got up, dressed quickly, and picked up the smaller rifle Jem had taught her to use. "What are you doing?" Jem whispered. "I am going with you," Julia said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You might need help." They crept out to the barn together and found two men trying to cut the lock on the corral gate where Jem kept his best horses. When Jem called out and identified himself, the rustlers pulled guns. But Julia fired a warning shot that splintered the fence post right between them, and the sudden realization that they were outnumbered made the rustlers run for their own horses and disappear into the night. Sheriff Morrison and a posse caught the men 2 days later, and Jem made sure everyone in town knew that his wife had helped drive them off. "I married the bravest woman in Nevada," he declared at the general store, and Julia blushed but did not deny it. She was brave now. Not fearless, but brave. There was a difference. As their first year of marriage drew to a close, Julia realized she was pregnant. The news brought a familiar flutter of fear. She was frightened of childbirth, frightened of being responsible for a helpless infant, but it also brought overwhelming joy. She was going to have a baby with the man she loved, and together they would teach their child to be brave and kind. Dr. Harrison came to the ranch several times during Julia's pregnancy to check on her. "You are doing fine, Mrs. Reeves," he assured her. "Strong and healthy. No reason to think there will be any problems." Jem was attentive and protective throughout Julia's pregnancy, taking on extra chores so she could rest and making sure she had everything she needed. And when her fear about the coming birth became overwhelming, he held her and reminded her of everything she had already overcome. "You were afraid of horses, and now you ride like you were born to it. You were afraid of being alone, and you spent a night by yourself at the ranch without any trouble. You faced down armed rustlers. You can do this too, and I will be right there with you the whole time." Julia went into labor on a warm day in late May. Jem sent one of the ranch hands racing to town for Dr. Harrison and Mrs. Henderson, who had experience with childbirth. The labor was long and painful, and there were moments when Julia was certain she could not continue, when the pain and fear were too much to bear. But Jem stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, encouraging her with every breath. "You are the strongest person I know," he told her as the contractions intensified. "You can do this, Julia, just a little longer." When their son finally entered the world with a loud, healthy cry, Julia wept with relief and joy. Jem cut the cord with shaking hands, his own eyes wet with tears, and then Dr. Harrison placed the baby in Julia's arms. "You have a fine boy," the doctor said. "Strong lungs on him." They named him Jacob Thomas Reeves, Jacob after Jem's grandfather and Thomas in memory of the man whose death had inadvertently brought Julia to Nevada. Jacob was a beautiful baby with dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and both parents fell instantly and completely in love. Motherhood brought new fears for Julia. She was terrified of everything that could go wrong, of all the ways a baby could be hurt or sick or in danger. But Jem reminded her that fear was information, not a prison. They took sensible precautions, but they did not let anxiety rule their lives. As Jacob grew from infant to toddler, Julia taught him the same lessons she had learned from his father. When he was afraid of the horses, she showed him how to approach them gently and confidently. When he cried at thunder, she held him and talked him through the storm. And Jem taught both of them that courage was not about being fearless, but about facing fear and acting anyway. The ranch prospered over the following years. Jem's reputation for breeding quality horses spread, and buyers came from as far as California to purchase his stock. Julia's garden became famous in Eureka for producing the finest vegetables in the county, and she sold her surplus at the mercantile. They hired 2 permanent ranch hands and built a larger barn. Life was good, though never without challenges. When Jacob was 3 years old, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Alina. Grace had her mother's delicate features and her father's fearless temperament. From the time she could walk, she followed her father everywhere, climbing fences and chasing chickens and generally giving Julia new reasons to practice conquering fear. "She is just like you," Julia told Jem one evening as they watched Grace trying to climb onto the back of a patient old gelding. "No," Jem said, pulling Julia close against his side. "She is like you too. She has your determination and your strength. You just do not always see it in yourself." But Julia could see it now when she looked in the mirror. The frightened girl who had arrived in Eureka 7 years ago was gone, replaced by a confident woman who ran a successful ranch alongside her husband, who raised 2 children with love and patience, who faced each new challenge with courage learned through practice and persistence. When Jacob was 5 and Grace was 2, a wildfire swept through the area during a particularly dry summer. Several neighboring ranches lost buildings, and everyone fought frantically to save homes and livestock. Julia worked alongside Jem and the ranch hands, wetting down roofs and moving animals to safety, too busy to be afraid until it was all over. Only later, when the danger had passed and their property was safe, did she realize what she had done. She had faced a genuine life-threatening crisis without panicking, without freezing, without letting fear control her. "I am proud of you," Jem said that night as they collapsed into bed, exhausted and reeking of smoke. "But I am not surprised. You have always been brave when it truly mattered." The years passed with the rhythm of ranch life. They faced droughts and hard winters, sick cattle and broken fences, good years and lean years. Julia learned to make decisions and solve problems, to trust her own judgment, to believe in her own strength. And through it all, Jem was there beside her, her partner in every sense of the word, still patient, still encouraging, still teaching her new ways to be brave. When Jacob turned 10, he announced that he wanted to learn to break horses like his father. Julia's first instinct was to say no, to protect him from danger. But she remembered how Jem had never protected her from her fears, only helped her face them. So she watched with her heart in her throat as Jem taught their son the careful, patient process of training young horses. And she bit back her warnings and trusted that Jem would keep Jacob safe. Grace, at 7, was already proving to be an excellent rider and had declared that she wanted to be a rancher like her parents. She helped Julia with the garden and the chickens, learning responsibility and the value of hard work. Both children were growing up strong and confident, knowing they were loved and supported in everything they did. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jem surprised Julia with a gift. It was a beautiful mare, dapple gray like Daisy had been, with gentle eyes and a sweet disposition. "She is yours," Jem said, handing Julia the lead rope. "I've been training her for months. She is gentle but spirited, and I think you two will suit each other perfectly." Julia ran her hand along the mare's sleek neck, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. 10 years ago, she would have been too terrified to even approach a horse. Now she was accepting one as her own. "What should I name her?" Julia asked. "You will know," Jem said. "Give it a few days. The right name will come to you." Julia named the mare Hope, because that was what she represented. Hope that fear could be overcome. Hope that courage could be learned. Hope that a frightened girl from Pennsylvania could become a confident ranch wife in Nevada. Hope that love and patience could transform a life completely. That autumn, Julia's old fears resurfaced one last time. Dr. Harrison came to the ranch with troubling news. There had been an outbreak of diphtheria in Eureka, and several children had died. He was warning all the families in the area to be vigilant and to bring any sick children to him immediately. Julia's terror for her children was immediate and overwhelming. She wanted to lock them in the house, to never let them out of her sight, to protect them from every possible danger. But Jem sat her down and reminded her of everything she had learned. "We will be careful," he said. "We will keep the children away from town until the outbreak passes. We will watch for symptoms. We will do everything sensible and necessary, but we cannot live in fear, Julia. We have to trust that we are doing our best and that our children are strong." It was the hardest test of Julia's courage yet, but she managed it. She kept busy, focused on the things she could control, and refused to let her imagination run wild with disaster scenarios. And both children stayed healthy, the outbreak passed, and life returned to normal. By the time Julia turned 30, she looked back on her 22-year-old self with something approaching disbelief. How had she ever been that frightened girl who could barely step off a stagecoach without panicking? How had she survived being so consumed by fear that simple daily tasks seemed impossible? But she knew the answer. Jeremiah Reeves had taught her courage. He had stood by her side through every challenge, patient and supportive, never mocking her fears but never letting her give in to them either. He had shown her that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And he had loved her, truly and completely, not in spite of her fears but through them, seeing the strong woman she could become and helping her become it. "What are you thinking about?" Jem asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the evening breeze. "About how far I have come," Julia said, leaning against his shoulder. "About how different my life is from what I imagined when I stepped off that stagecoach in Eureka. Better or worse?" Jem asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Infinitely better," Julia said. "I found courage I did not know I had, I found work I love, I found a home, and most importantly, I found you." Jem kissed the top of her head. "I am the lucky one. You made me a better man, Julia. You showed me that patience and kindness are not weakness but strength. You gave me a family and a real home, not just a house. I love you more now than the day we married." "I love you too," Julia said. "Thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for teaching me to be brave." "You taught yourself," Jem corrected. "I just pointed you in the right direction. The courage was always there inside you. You just needed to learn how to access it." As the years continued to unfold, the Reeves family thrived. The ranch expanded as they acquired more land from a neighbor who decided to move back east. Jacob grew into a tall, responsible young man who shared his father's gift with horses. Grace surprised everyone by developing a talent for business and handling the ranch's financial records with impressive skill. Julia became known throughout the region not just as Jem Reeves's capable wife, but as a woman of substance in her own right. She served on the school board when Eureka finally built a proper schoolhouse. She organized a women's auxiliary to help new families settling in the area. She used her own experiences to help other frightened newcomers find their footing in the harsh but beautiful Nevada landscape. One of those women was a young widow named Catherine who arrived in Eureka with 2 small children and nowhere to go. Julia saw her own former self in Catherine's terrified eyes and immediately offered help. She arranged for Catherine to stay at the boarding house, helped her find work at the mercantile, and spent hours talking her through her fears about building a new life in an unfamiliar place. "How did you become so brave?" Catherine asked one day as they worked together in Julia's garden. Julia thought about the question carefully. "I had help," she said finally. "My husband taught me that courage is not about not being afraid. It is about doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid. Every day, I practiced being a little bit braver." Eventually, those small acts of courage added up to a completely different life. When Jacob turned 18, he announced that he wanted to attend agricultural college in California to learn modern ranching techniques. Julia's first reaction was fear. Her baby was going so far away. What if something happened? But she swallowed the panic and smiled instead. "Your father and I are proud of you," she said. "You should follow your dreams. We will be here when you come home." Grace, now 15, was already making plans to expand the ranch's horse breeding program. She had a vision for creating a line of horses specifically suited to the Nevada climate and terrain, and she had the knowledge and determination to make it happen. Watching her daughter's confidence and capability, Julia sometimes marveled at the contrast between Grace's fearlessness and her own youthful terror. But then Jem would remind her that Grace's courage came partly from growing up with parents who had taught her that fear was natural but manageable, that challenges could be overcome, that she was capable of far more than she might think. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Eureka turned out for a celebration at the church hall. Julia and Jem had become pillars of the community, respected and loved by almost everyone who knew them. As Julia looked around the crowded room at the friends they had made and the life they had built, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Sheriff Morrison, now retired but still spry, gave a toast. "20 years ago, I told a frightened young lady that Jeremiah Reeves was a good man. I am pleased to say I was right. But what I did not know then was that Julia Parker would turn out to be one of the finest women this territory has ever seen. Here's to 20 more years of happiness for both of them." The crowd cheered and clinked glasses, and Jem pulled Julia into his arms for a kiss that made her blush like a young bride all over again. Later, as they drove home in the wagon under a sky full of stars, Julia reflected on the strange turns life could take. If Thomas Wendell had not died, she would have married him and lived a completely different life. She would never have met Jem, never learned to overcome her fears, never become the woman she was now. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if things had gone differently? She asked Jem. "All the time," he admitted. "If you had not shown up at that stagecoach station, if someone else had hired you first, if you had decided to go back east instead of taking a chance on me. But then I stop wondering and just feel grateful for what we have." "Me too," Julia said, snuggling against his side as the familiar silhouette of their ranch appeared in the distance. Home. It was truly home now. Not a frightening wilderness, but a place of safety and love and endless possibility. The following years brought the changes that time always brings. Jacob returned from college with new ideas and a degree in agricultural science. He began implementing modern ranching techniques that increased the productivity of their cattle operation. Grace's horse breeding program proved successful, and buyers from across the West sought out Reeves Ranch horses for their hardiness and intelligence. Julia and Jem settled into middle age with grace and contentment. Julia's dark hair gained silver threads, and Jem's face gained more lines from years of squinting into the sun. But the love between them only deepened. They knew each other completely now, knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, knew how to support and challenge each other, knew that their partnership was the foundation of everything good in their lives. When Julia turned 45, Grace married a young rancher from a neighboring property, and the wedding was a joyous celebration that lasted 2 days. Watching her daughter pledge her life to a good man who loved her reminded Julia of her own wedding day, remembered the mixture of hope and lingering fear she had felt, the wonder that someone like Jem could love someone like her. "She looks happy," Jem said, standing beside Julia and watching Grace and her new husband dance. "She is," Julia agreed. "She chose well. He is a good man like her father." "I hope I taught our children something about what love should look like," Jem said. "Partnership, respect, support through hard times, celebration in good times." "You did," Julia assured him. "They saw it every day growing up. They know what a good marriage looks like because they watched ours." A year after Grace's wedding, Jacob brought home a young woman he had met at college, a professor's daughter named Elizabeth who shared his passion for agriculture and modern ranching methods. She was intelligent and kind, and she fit into the family as if she had always belonged. When Jacob asked his parents' blessing to marry her, both Julia and Jem gave it gladly. As Julia approached 50, she found herself becoming a grandmother. Grace had a baby boy first, then a girl. Jacob and Elizabeth had twin daughters. The ranch that had once been a place of terror for Julia became filled with the laughter of grandchildren, and she discovered that being a grandmother was one of life's greatest joys. She taught the grandchildren the same lessons Jem had taught her all those years ago. When they were afraid of horses, she showed them how to approach calmly and confidently. When they faced challenges, she reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear but action despite it. And always, she made sure they knew they were loved unconditionally, just as Jem had loved her. Jem remained strong and active well into his 60s, still working the ranch alongside his son, still training horses, still the calm, patient man Julia had fallen in love with 3 decades earlier. But eventually, time took its toll as it always does. His joints began to ache in cold weather, and he moved a little slower than he once had. Julia nursed him through several bouts of winter illness, repaying the care he had given her throughout their marriage. And Jem bore his physical limitations with the same grace and patience he had always shown, never complaining, always finding something to be grateful for. "I have had a good life," he told Julia one winter evening as they sat by the fire, their hands clasped between them. "Better than I ever expected or deserved. Every day with you has been a gift." "Do not talk like that," Julia said, though her voice caught. "You are not going anywhere for a long time yet." "I hope not," Jem said. "I want to see those grandchildren grow up. I want to celebrate our 50th anniversary. I want at least 20 more years of watching you be brave and beautiful and amazing." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "I would never have become any of those things without you. You gave me courage, Jem. You gave me a life." "You gave yourself courage," Jem corrected. "I just held your hand while you learned. The strength was always yours, Julia. Always." They did celebrate their 50th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by friends from throughout the region, by the life they had built together over 5 decades. Julia looked at Jem across the crowded room and caught his eye, and in that moment, they were young again. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The speech she gave at the anniversary celebration became legendary in the family, passed down through generations. Julia stood before everyone who had gathered and told her story honestly. She told them about being the frightened girl who stepped off the stagecoach in Eureka with no prospects and paralyzing fears. She told them about meeting a kind cowboy who taught her that courage could be learned. And she told them about the 50 years of love and partnership that had followed. "Fear never completely goes away," Julia said, her voice strong and clear. I still feel afraid sometimes, but Jeremiah taught me that fear does not have to control you. You acknowledge it, you understand it, and then you do what needs to be done anyway. That lesson changed my life completely. It turned me from a timid girl into a rancher's wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who has lived a full and adventurous life. And it all happened because one good man had patience and kindness and love enough to stand by my side while I learned to be brave. There was not a dry eye in the room when she finished, and Jem pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the cheers and applause of everyone present. In the final years of their lives, Julia and Jem settled into a comfortable routine. They turned over most of the ranch operations to Jacob and his family, though Jem still visited the horses daily, and Julia still tended her garden. They sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset paint the Nevada mountains in shades of gold and purple, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. When Jem finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, Julia grieved deeply but not hopelessly. She had loved him with her whole heart for 53 years, and she carried that love with her in every breath. She knew how lucky she had been to find such a partner, such a friend, such a love. At Jem's funeral, Julia stood before the crowded church and spoke about her husband without notes, her voice steady and strong. "Jeremiah Reeves was the best man I ever knew," she said. "He was patient when I needed patience. He was strong when I needed strength. He was kind when I needed kindness. He taught me to be brave, not through lectures or criticism, but through example and encouragement. He stood by my side through every challenge and celebrated every triumph. He loved me completely, not despite my flaws but through them. And because of his love, I became someone I never imagined I could be. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will also be grateful every day that I had the privilege of being his wife." Julia lived for another 12 years after Jem's death, staying active and engaged with her family and community. She continued to help newcomers to the area find their footing, always patient with their fears, always encouraging them to be brave. She told stories about Jem to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, making sure they understood the kind of man he had been and the values he had lived by. She published a small book about her experiences titled Learning Courage, A Nevada Life, which became popular among women in the West who faced similar challenges. In it, she detailed the specific techniques Jem had taught her for managing fear, and she received letters from women all over the country telling her how the book had helped them overcome their own paralyzing anxieties. On what would have been her and Jem's 65th wedding anniversary, Julia visited his grave at the cemetery outside Eureka. She brought wildflowers from the ranch and sat beside the headstone for a long time, talking to him as if he could hear. "I am 92 years old now," she told him. "Can you believe it? That frightened 22-year-old girl lived to be 92, and she had an amazing life. We had an amazing life together, Jem. I never thanked you enough for saving me, for teaching me, for loving me. I could never have imagined, standing terrified on that street in Eureka so many years ago, that I would end up here, with this incredible family and this rich, full life. You gave me all of that. You stood by my side forever, just like you promised, and I will love you forever in return." Julia Parker Reeves passed away peacefully in her sleep a few months later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She died without fear, ready to take the next adventure, confident that Jem would be waiting for her on the other side. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she had touched over the decades. Jacob, now in his 70s, spoke about his mother with love and admiration. "My mother taught us that courage is not something you are born with, it is something you practice," he said. She showed us that fear is natural but should never be a prison. And most importantly, she demonstrated that true love, patient love, supportive love, can transform a life completely. She and my father built something beautiful together, and that beauty continues in all of us who love them. The Reeves Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations, a testament to what Julia and Jem had built together. The story of the timid mail-order bride who learned courage from a patient cowboy became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as a reminder that people can change, that love matters, that patience and kindness can transform the world one person at a time. In the family Bible, preserved carefully through the years, someone had written on the front page, Jeremiah Reeves taught Julia Parker courage. Together they built a legacy of love, bravery, and unwavering partnership that will echo through all the generations to come. And in the old house on Reeves Ranch, now occupied by Julia and Jem's great-great-grandchildren, a framed photograph still hung in the place of honor above the fireplace. It showed a young couple on their wedding day in 1882, the man tall and confident, the woman smaller but with a light in her eyes that suggested joy and hope and the first stirrings of courage. Beneath the photograph, a brass plate read, Julia and Jeremiah Reeves. He taught her bravery. She taught him that patience and love can heal any wound. Together they proved that two imperfect people can create something perfectly beautiful. The grandchildren who grew up in that house heard the stories and learned the lessons. They learned that fear was information, not a command. They learned that courage could be practiced and improved. They learned that true love stood by through challenges and celebrated triumphs. And they learned that sometimes the most unlikely pairing, a frightened woman and a patient cowboy, could create a legacy that lasted forever. The town of Eureka changed over the years, from mining camp to stable community to modern small town. But the story of Julia and Jem Reeves remained constant. It was told to children as a bedtime story, shared at community gatherings as an example of what partnership should be, and held up as proof that people could overcome their limitations and become more than they ever imagined possible. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when their earthly journey is complete, Julia and Jem Reeves stood hand in hand, watching over the family they had created, the lives they had touched, and the legacy of courage and love they had left behind. The timid mail-order bride had indeed feared everything when she first arrived in Nevada all those years ago. But the brave cowboy had taught her courage and stood by her side forever, exactly as promised. And in the end, that made all the difference. They had built not just a ranch or a family, but a testament to the transformative power of patient love. And that testament would endure for generations yet to come.